Hi everyone, thank you for joining me today on this brief presentation on monogram design. My name is Matthijs Herzberg. I am from the Netherlands, currently living and working in New Orleans, Louisiana as a freelance graphic and type designer. Over the past few years I have fallen into a bit of a niche, monogram design. I've designed several dozen monograms for clients around the world, mostly for personal use, also for commercial use. Through trial and error, I've learned quite a bit about the subject, so today I am going to try to share as much of that knowledge with you as I can within the next 15 minutes. So, before we dive too deep, a little terminology. The image on the left is not a monogram. The image on the right is a monogram. In a monogram, letters are fused together. If you were to remove one of the letters, the other one would no longer be complete. A cipher, on the other hand, is a design made from letters that may or may not be interlocking, but are not merged. While I guarantee you will never be approached by a client asking for a cipher, it's still good to know the difference. However, for simplicity's sake, I will only use the term monogram in this presentation. I will also be focusing on the Latin alphabet, as that is what I'm most familiar with, although most of the design principles I will cover also extend to other phonetic alphabets. Monograms have been around since at least 350 BC, the oldest known examples having been found on the backs of ancient Greek coins, where they were used to signify the city-state of origin. Monograms have since seen varied usage throughout history, as symbols of rulers, nations, and organizations, and later seeing great popularity as company logos. Down here in New Orleans, many of the wrought iron balconies throughout the historic French Quarter feature the monograms of their original owners. In short, monograms have become a status symbol, which is also one of the reasons that they are still popular with individuals and companies today. Let's talk about designing a monogram. The single most vital aspect is that the letters of your monogram interact well. This means taking into account the basic rules of composition, which apply to all graphic arts. Keep your eye on negative space, try to balance it. Similarly, balance your positive space to ensure you don't create overly dense areas. It may seem obvious, but be sure that your letters remain recognizable, and therefore legible. A monogram does not have to be symmetrical, but it should be optically balanced. One thing you want to keep in mind is the logic behind letter placement. Traditionally, a man's monogram has a different layout than a woman's monogram. However, I find this to be archaic and unnecessary, and I don't pay attention to it unless a client specifically asks for it. What is important is logic. If you're making a monogram for Henry Carl Smith, a monogram should easily read HKS, not SHK, even if the latter makes for a prettier composition in your opinion. Similarly, you want to consider hierarchy. In a monogram for John and Kate Smith, the S from their last name should be the most important, with the two first name initials being secondary. Hierarchy can of course be implemented in different ways. The example here is size, but it may as well come from color, style, layout, etc. You will also want to consider the application of your monogram. What is your client going to do with it? A monogram designed for a wax stamp must work at a small scale. A monogram that's going to be engraved must work monochrome. A monogram that's going to be cross-stitched has to be designed on a pixel grid. The best way to find optimal monogram compositions is by drawing thumbnail sketches. Just start doodling, get in the flow. Try tons of different options. Your aim is to include as little detail as possible and instead look at the basic skeletons of your letters and the compositions that they form. As you draw your thumbnails, your monogram will evolve and improve. It quickly becomes clear what does and what does not work. I generally find that the more time I allow myself to spend on the thumbnail stage, the better the eventual monogram tends to be. As you mess around with different letter combinations, you will find that some offer far more opportunities than others. Symmetrical letters are easier to work with, as are pairings that look similar to each other. MW, for instance, is a glorious pair. Unfortunately, more often than not, you will be handed a far trickier letter combo, and this is where you need to get creative. But while some pairings will give you a headache, there is always a solution out there, I promise. You just have to find it. One trick which always helps me is to not get stuck on Roman capitals. While they are the most common letter form for monograms, you can also try black letter, italics, scripts, brush letters, psychedelic blobs, or whatever style you can think of. Even lowercase letter forms can work at times, but keep in mind that this does go against logic. Names are always capitalized after all, and therefore a lowercase monogram can seem a little weird. You can also freely mix styles. Take for instance the monogram on the left, where an ornate script D and W wrap around a Roman M. Besides trying different styles, don't hesitate to modify your letter forms. This isn't type design, which means that your letters can have wildly different proportions for the sake of forming a pleasing composition. Feel free to stretch your letters or change their proportions to make them fit into a certain shape. Just keep legibility in mind. Your aim should be, at the very least, for the letters to form a pleasant and balanced composition. But sometimes there's more possibilities that allow your letters to carry extra power. For instance, sometimes an opportunity presents itself to make a monogram that is also an ambigram, a mambogram as I like to call it. These two mambograms, for instance, can be turned upside down and will still read the same. Letters can also come together to form an icon or symbol, such as these monograms that I made for a knife maker with the initials JL, a book designer with the initials HJ, and for a bar named the Hitching Post, HP. To give your monogram a certain wow factor, it can be made to be ornamental. Now a little can go a long way, but sometimes more is more. I highly recommend studying work by the Victorian masters to get a good understanding of ornament and what it should and should not do. Do not use ornament to cover up a mediocre monogram. Instead, approach your monogram from the ground up. Find a good composition before you add any details. You can also see here that there is still hierarchy between monogram and ornament through color and contrast, causing the ornament to be less overwhelming. Make your bare letter forms more decorative by adding spurs, Tuscan serifs, and swashes. Give them effects like hatched fills, outlines, and drop shadows for extra punch, or combine them all. You will know when you've gone too far, because you will not be able to recognize the monogram underneath all your decoration. Be it to surround the monogram or to fill areas of negative space, curlicues and acanthus leaves can really spice things up, as can imagery like crowns, shields, crossed swords, or other objects. This is also an opportunity to refer to the monogram's owner. For instance, the monogram on the left contains a hidden honeybee, as well as a small capital A that's hidden in the foot of the E, both references to the client's daughter. After drawing the thumbnails, I refine the ideas a bit further. If the client has the budget, I refine several ideas and present them each in a neat pencil sketch, shown here. These monograms are at an intermediate stage, developed but not finalized, and still a little rough around the edges. You can produce your monogram in whatever medium you are comfortable with, but again, consider application. My final deliverables are usually vector, drawn in Illustrator or Font Lab, mostly with the pen tool. Vector offers the most versatility to clients, as it can easily be used for most purposes, such as engraving and printing. Occasionally, I will draw a monogram in pen and ink, especially when a handmade look is desired. Now, I do always draw my letters from scratch, as it allows more versatility, but you can use a font as your foundation if you must. Now, I've made a lot of these highly ornamental monograms for clients' personal use, and what they all have in common is that the main purpose of the monogram is the enjoyment of the owner. For an individual, a monogram is usually a fun, shiny, personalized object, and as such the only thing that really matters is that they like it. Now, when designing a monogram as a logo, on the other hand, you are faced with the same guidelines that apply to general logo design. This usually means that your logo has to appeal to a certain audience, be appropriate for the product, and so forth. This consequently entails that a monogram shouldn't be your first and only consideration, but rather a solution for your brand identity that you've ended up at through research. Monograms are effective at expressing luxury, craftsmanship, and history, which is why they're especially appropriate for brands that wish to express such qualities, such as the ones pictured here. Monograms can also be a useful secondary mark. Take a look, for instance, at this Victorian-inspired logo I designed for a band. It's cool, or at least I like to think so, but it's also very busy, and at smaller sizes it can turn into eye dirt. As such, I made a monogram which can be used where the word mark doesn't fit well, utilizing the same swashy capitals from the main logo. Another example is this monogram for a branding project I'm currently working on, a bar named the Hitching Post. Here, the monogram isn't directly related to the word mark, which is a sign painterly brush crypt, but is clearly related stylistically, as they both exude the same cowboy kitsch vibe and share a color scheme. As many people have said before me, learn the rules, then break them. Some of my most interesting monograms have been the result of pushing conventions and experimenting. Inspiration can come from all sorts of places, and there are many historical sources to draw from. I personally prefer to separate artistic consumption and creation. I may spend hours looking at type and design, but when I am working on something, I find I create more unique and interesting things if I refrain from peeking at the work of others. However, that's just me. If you have your own method of working, I'm sure you know what's best for you. All in all, monograms are incredibly versatile, and it can make a very useful asset to your skill set. If the undertaking seems daunting, start small. Make a simple monogram for a friend or a loved one or a pet, and keep it low pressure. And most importantly, have fun with it. Thank you.